Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us in person and online. I'm Derrick Pratt, our Director of Education at the Erie Canal Museum. Thanks for joining us today for the first of four deeper dives of our Ditches to Dishes, an Erie Canal Journey series. So in case you're unaware, so for a little background on why we're doing this marathon of talks, the Erie Canal Museum has a pretty successful program of giving educator talks throughout the state. Last year, I believe, we had educators speak in 13 different counties across New York State in, I think, 50 different, primarily libraries, as well as historic societies. That's a lot, So luckily, though, that success is in part allowed us to hire several new employees in the Canal Museum, in our education department. These are some of our most popular talks. So we're training up the staff on these, and we thought, hey, if I have to give these talks anyway, might as well give them to the public as well. But that said, if anyone here or online knows a good library in their area or historic society and wants to book an Erie Canal educator talk, give us a call, send me an email, etc. So today, for this talk, we're going to start out with basics of the Erie Canal, the nuts and bolts of what the Erie Canal is, where it went, who it impacted, when it existed. Spoiler alert, it still exists to this day, etc. Before I begin, though, I want to give a couple plugs for our upcoming events. Next week, Thursday, the 25th of April at noon, we will have a lunchtime lecture featuring Chris Sabick, the director of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, discussing canal-related shipwrecks at the bottom of Onondaga Lake. So that sounds very interesting. I don't know anything about that topic, really, but I believe they were discovered during the cleanup of the lake. And then on May 8th, Yes, May 8th is our next deeper dive. We will be working with the Matilda Jocelyn Gage House to host author Michael Miller, who has recently written a historic fiction book, High Bridge, which is about Matilda Jocelyn Gage and Grover Cleveland teaming up to solve an Erie Canal mystery. We will discuss the book with the author. He'll be here, as well as Danielle Nagel from the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation, and me and our education coordinator, Carrie Eaton, will be having kind of a panel discussion on the book and generally the merits and pitfalls of historic fiction. So check those out if you can. Be sure to register for annual passes for both deeper dives and lunchtime lectures. Then you don't have to, remember to sign up every time. You just automatically will get a Zoom link and are also welcome to show up in person. All right, with all that out of the way, let's get into the basics of the Erie Canal. All right. So to understand the Erie Canal, we've got to understand what is now New York and its geography. And to understand that, we've really got to go back about 12 to 10,000 years, the end of the last ice age. During that time, about 10,000 years ago, the glaciers were receding. They had carved out, things like the Finger Lakes, a lot of the geography we are familiar with in New York to this day. And as they melted, as we know here in upstate New York, when the ice and snow and stuff melt, they leave behind a lot of water. These are huge glaciers, so they left behind these gigantic glacial lakes. And the footprint of what is today Lake Ontario, Oneida Lake, kind of the tops of the Finger Lakes, as well as the Montezuma Marshes, etc. they were all together in what is called Great Lake Iroquois, this giant post-glacial lake. Nowadays, all of those lakes drain out ultimately through the St. Lawrence River. However, during this time period, the St. Lawrence is still covered in ice. So that water needs to find a new way to get to the ocean. And it did that by carving out essentially a giant canyon, which is today's Hudson River, as well as crucially right here, the Mohawk River. These two systems, river systems, cut through the Appalachian mountain range, which stretches, from Georgia all the way up to Maine, presenting a formidable barrier to anyone trying to move between the coast and the Great Lakes. To be clear, the Mohawk actually separates the Catskills from the Adirondacks, in case we have any people who really want to correct me on that. And the Adirondacks are distinct from the Appalachians. Anyway, that's not super relevant though. What is important though is that the Mohawk River Valley and the Hudson represent the only point in the Appalachian Mountain range under 600 feet in elevation. This is an incredibly important natural water route. Right as the glaciers are starting to recede, this is when you start seeing the first people begin moving into New York State as well, following kind of migrating herds along the banks of this Great Lake, we believe. Eventually, those people would take advantage of these incredible natural transportation systems, and over time would develop into what is known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which has lived for time immemorial across what is now upstate New York. Europeans begin arriving in the area mid-1600s. First, you have the Dutch. They quickly realized the importance of this natural route, heading up the Hudson River and doing a lot of fur trading along the Mohawk, establishing towns like Albany and Schenectady during this time period. And you start getting some early settlers in the Mohawk River, taking advantage of these natural transportation routes. When the English take over, you have more folks move in, more European settlers moving into the Mohawk. You've got Dutch, Palatine, German, Scotch, Irish, etc. However, European colonists were typically attempting to produce goods for the market. And really living in the Hudson River, while there were a lot of natural advantages to this natural waterway system, it was not great for moving bulk goods to be competitive in markets yet. There's still a lot of waterfalls, rapids, etc. You would have to, if you reached these various obstacles, take everything out of your boat, as well as the boat itself, and carry them around the obstacle. So really, settlement by Europeans and Americans does not really advance until really past the Mohawk, until after the Revolution. Critical during the Revolution at this time, this area is a major front in the Revolution. You have what is called the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, characterized by many as a form of genocide, conducted by the American Revolutionary armies against especially the Seneca, but also the Cayuga as well in Western New York, kind of burning down Haudenosaunee settlements and quote unquote clearing the land. Much of this land, including right where we are now, would be parceled out into what's called the military tract for veterans who would receive as payment for their service in the war land. And that was hoped to encourage settlement. But again, the issues of this transportation system post-revolution rear their heads, its head, I guess. Settlers start moving into Western New York, but again, can't transport things well to the East Coast and make any money doing that. So this area kind of languishes in the 1790s. What's called the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Company, a private corporation, is founded that makes some small improvement. It builds some small canals and locks in places like Little Falls and Rome. They clear obstructions in the Mohawk River, but it's never super successful. They make some innovations in engineering and improve the waterway slightly, but at about the time when they're going to try to build the canal, it would take approximately 1 month to go from Buffalo to New York City, and to transport 1 ton of wheat, it would cost about $100. This is not efficient or competitive. However, even though the Western Inland is kind of this failure, it inspires more people to think about improving the waterways of New York. Prominent figure in that is often considered kind of the founder of Syracuse, though he didn't actually found the settlement, but one of the major speculators in the area, Joshua Foreman. He proposes that in 1808, that the state kind of survey the area to see if a canal is practical. And eventually this idea really catches on, especially with farmers in upstate New York. And it'll all eventually pay off in 1817 when DeWitt Clinton is elected governor, who runs on this canal platform. And on July 4th, 1817, they start digging the Erie Canal in Rome. And here it is. So the Erie Canal is this incredible engineering feat that they are proposing, a canal connecting Lake Erie all the way to the Hudson River. It will be 363 miles long, overcoming a total of 571 feet in elevation, with its highest point being at Buffalo, at the far end, so that Lake Erie water can feed pretty much the entire western half of the Erie Canal. It'll do that through the use of 83 lift locks, as well as a number of other engineering feats, most notably 17 aqueducts, as well as the Great Embankment over the Irondequoit Creek, are some of the really big engineering challenges they come to. The other important lesson they learned from the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Company is that private corporations really just couldn't get a work of this scale done, especially in early America. The capital was not available, nor was kind of the central planning, and also the Western Inland had this issue because, you know, they were beholden to their stakeholders, right? So they had to cut some corners, save costs, et cetera. So New York State itself takes on the burden of constructing the canal and the debt going along with it. They will invest a little over $7 million in building the Erie Canal. And this is a huge risk New York is taking financially. $7 million doesn't sound a lot to us today. That's, like one highway exit in today's budgets, right? The age of trillion-dollar infrastructure projects, but $7 million at the time is enormous. I've seen some estimates saying this represented about 1/3 of the total GDP of New York State. Others that this is equivalent to what America invested in putting a man on the moon in the 60s. This is a huge risk New York is taking because New York isn't what it is today. It's not the giant financial center that it is. It's much smaller. So they're taking this big risk. Amazingly, this project only takes 8 years to complete. So let's talk about how they do it in a mere 8 years. Well, first, the canal needed to be designed and engineered. At this time in American history, there is no American School of Civil Engineering. The only engineering school in the country is West Point, the military academy there, but the Army was busy with those guys. So the state was kind of challenged with who's going to build this, who's going to design this thing. And the options were to kind of rent out a European engineer. They have a bunch of canals over in Europe, or find people locally to build the canal. This would be the much less expensive option, and this is the era of good feelings, as it's called, this huge nationalistic time period. America had just finished the War of 1812 and lost, so we were all full of pride in what a free country could do. So they really want to get, American engineers building the canal, and ultimately chosen as the lead engineers on the project are the two men at the top here. You've got Benjamin Wright of Rome, who had actually worked on the Western Inland Canal beforehand, and James Geddes. For those of you from Central New York, you're probably familiar with his last name. They have a whole town named after him. He's from Syracuse, salt boiler as well as teacher, jack of a lot of trades. They'll do a lot of the initial surveys and lead the project. Wright is initially assigned the middle section of the canal. Geddes is in charge of the Champlain Canal, but they'll both work together a lot. Then they find a lot of talented local folks to serve as their assistants. We have just a couple here who I want to highlight. We've got Candace White from Whitesboro. He's a young man who was sent over to Europe to walk thousands, or to England specifically, to walk thousands of miles of their canals in the first kind of year or two of the project, where he learns kind of all there is to know about canal building from the English, comes back and contributes a lot of important innovations. Most notably, he will produce the first hydraulic cement in America. This is cement that hardens underwater. In case you haven't heard, canals have a lot of water in them, so this is important to have produced in America. Otherwise, we would have had to import it from Europe, which would have been prohibitively expensive. He finds, according to legend, though some recent scholarship disputes it, he discovered it, the necessary limestone, in my hometown of Chittenango. So since it makes Chittenango look good, I won't let the truth get in the way of a good story today. But anyway, another important figure is Nathan Roberts, a math teacher from Canastota. He makes a number of important innovations we'll talk about, notably the Lockport Flight of Five, which we'll look at a little bit more shortly. And then one of my favorite canal folks, a guy who I think is fascinating, is the man at the far end, John B. Jervis. He's about 19 years old when the canal project starts. Essentially, Benjamin Wright owed his dad a favor and got this kid a job clearing brush for Nathan Roberts' surveying team. Jervis learned how to survey at night from Roberts, and by the end of that 8-year period, he would be in charge of engineering an entire section of the canal and go on to be America's foremost civil engineer for the next generation, really. Notably, constructing the first locomotive in America, as well as the Old Croton Aqueduct, which provided New York City with its first consistent supply of clean drinking water. So, interesting guy. However, these folks were just designing the canal. They were not really getting that dirty. They weren't picking up a shovel. They were actually, I assume, getting very dirty as they were surveying, but not shoveling or anything. So let's talk a little about how you actually dug the canal. So thousands participated in the digging. They began in the middle division, so between Utica on the Mohawk River and Montezuma on the Seneca River. They did this because that was the easiest section to build. It's relatively flat. They had to produce very few locks, aqueducts, etc. And like I said, these guys are figuring out how to build a canal. So you should start with the easiest bit first, learn from your mistakes there. And it only took 3 years to complete this about 90-mile section from Utica to Montezuma. So navigation on the canal starts in 1820, really, between that stretch, including right here in Syracuse. The way they did it, so the state didn't just hire all the laborers, et cetera. What they had was a contracting system. This is really innovative. It's still kind of what we do today on infrastructure projects. The Erie Canal helps start this trend of hiring contractors. Folks will be contracted out to about half a mile to 2 miles of canal, and then it was their problem to figure out how to build it. Then, state engineers would come around, make sure that the canal was up to specs, et cetera, and that they were good to go. Then you'd get the rest of your money, what have you. So that leads us to who were those contractors hiring to dig the canal? Often pointed to is an 1820 report from the canal commissioners about who was building the canal that talks about how about 3/4 of the workforce was quote unquote born among us, meaning born in America. So it's believed that most of the folks digging the middle division of the canal are kind of these local farmers from the Mohawk and central New York regions. Because, again, it's the easier section to build. This is a more settled area. People would go and take a few days off from the farm, help dig the canal, make some extra wages. However, that does indicate that about 1/4 of the workforce, even at that time, was immigrant. Then, as you go further afield into the more sparsely settled regions of the state and the more challenging sections to build, like the Montezuma Marshes, like what's pictured here, the famous Lockport Deep Cut, where workers not only had to shovel, but also blast through the Niagara Escarpment made of incredibly hard dolomite to build a man-made canyon for about 2 miles. You get more and more immigrants appearing in canal labor. Most famously, the Irish. They'll become very well associated with the Erie Canal, but also you have a lot of Scottish, Welsh, German, and French Canadian immigrants, as well as African-American individuals will help build the canal at parts, including here in Syracuse. We have a man by the name of Isaac Wales, who participated in digging the canal, which leads to an interesting point we should probably discuss, which is the fact that slavery was still legal in New York State. Isaac Wales is an interesting case. He had arrived here in Onondaga County enslaved. However, he took out a loan to purchase his freedom, which he paid off by digging the canal here in Syracuse. Actually, the first Black resident of Syracuse, to our knowledge. We don't have any evidence of enslaved people digging the canal, though, at this time. To be clear, let's also talk a little about how these folks are paid. You'll learn a bit more about that if you stick around for some of our later talks. But these workers are largely paid in room and board, so a place to stay and food to eat, as well as lots of whiskey to drink. Between 10 and 15 ounces a day were the wages of a canal laborer. So you can imagine a pretty dangerous job. Most of this work is done by hand, just guys with shovels, digging a ditch for 360 miles. But there are a number of new labor-saving inventions created as well. See them here, we see some early versions of cranes. Famously, there's the stump puller. These about 16-foot high pulley systems that could take about 40 stumps a day out of the ground. And even the modern design of the wheelbarrow is created in Rome for the Erie Canal project. Before, they had been pretty much boxes with a wheel on top, the rounded sides that we are now familiar with, which make it a lot easier to dump dirt, are made for the Erie Canal. And through all this hard work, The Erie Canal was completed, like I said, in only 8 years, and it is immediately considered an engineering marvel. Today, it is recognized by the American Society of Civil Engineering as the birthplace of American civil engineering, while Benjamin Wright is recognized by them as the father of American civil engineering. And they'll accomplish some incredibly impressive feats. Probably one of the most notable ones is what we see here on the right for you guys, which is Lockport. You've got the Lockport flight of 5. They overcome about 60 feet in elevation with 5 locks stacked on top of each other. This is the same cliff that Niagara Falls falls over, right? So they overcome it with the staircase of locks. And then we saw previously the deep cut. So to allow water from Lake Erie to get into the system, they've had to blast out the canyon because the top of the Niagara escarpment in Lockport is slightly higher than Lake Erie. So they had to make, this to get to the level of Lake Erie as well. Incredibly hard to do. Also pictured there is a photo from our archives of the Montezuma or Richmond Aqueduct, the second longest on the system. It crossed the Seneca River. This is actually the second version of the canal pictured there, which we'll talk a little about in a second. You can still see, I believe, 9 of the arches on it. Also, I mentioned briefly the Great Embankment out by Pittsburgh. That's a 1 mile long, 70-foot high berm that carries the canal over the Irondequoit Creek Valley. Accounts we have from people traveling on the canal say it was like you were flying, essentially, because your canal boat's over the tops of trees at the time. So yeah, they built the canal, completed in October of 1825, culminates in the Wedding of the Waters celebration when freshly reelected Governor DeWitt Clinton takes his boat, Seneca Chief, from Buffalo to New York City and pours a bucket of Lake Erie water into New York Harbor, symbolizing the the wedding of the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean. So let's talk about how that transforms New York and America in a lot of ways. So remember, we talked about it took about 30 days before the canal and cost $100 a ton to move between Buffalo and New York City. With the canal, it now takes 5 to 7 days to make the same voyage and costs less than $10. Cities and towns will explode along the banks of the Erie Canal. Another nickname of the canal will be the mother of cities eventually. Here we see Syracuse, but Rochester itself sees a 500% population growth in the decade after the canal opens, becoming the flour city, as it's called, producing over half of America's entire flour at that time period. Again, we'll talk a bit more about that later today. At its peak, Rochester will grind over 25,000 bushels of wheat a day. Syracuse prospers due to the natural salt brine in the area, becoming the salt city, again, producing over half of the country's salt. And it's not just the big cities that grow. Towns like my hometown, again, of Chittenango, will actually have higher populations during the height of the Erie Canal than they even do today. And people are moving there, not just because there's this cool waterway, but because they can make a lot of money living there as well. In addition to these bulk goods, along the canal will form a number of other industries like potteries. American Express will in part begin thanks to the improved transportation of the Erie Canal. We've got things like caskets, steel, typewriters, canneries, all form along the canal. And as we see here too, banks Almost every building you see in that picture is a bank. Actually, it's all banks and theaters right there. So you've got an entertainment industry growing along the canal as well. So yeah, New York City soon becomes America's primary commercial hub and its real major shipping center. Before it had been in competition with the ports of Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans, Boston. But after the canal opens, you can now take a boat all the way to Minnesota, right? So you can also take a boat back from Minnesota, right? And it all gets channeled through New York City for the most part. Yeah, so the canal is incredibly successful financially, so much so that everywhere else wants a canal. You enter an era of what's called Canal Mania. Across the country, thousands of miles of canal are constructed by other states as well as New York, as we see illustrated here. So the Erie Canal cuts across the middle of the state, creating kind of a spine, if you will, for a larger network of canals, as every other corner of the state wants their own canal. You can see a few that still exist, like the Oswego Canal, hooking Lake Ontario up to the system, and the Champlain Canal, again, hooking Lake Champlain up. They're not very creative with their canal names. The Cayuga-Seneca Canal, hooking Cayuga and Seneca Lakes up to the canal. But then you have also some of the more hard to build, challenging ones, a bit more fanciful. You've got the Genesee Valley Canal, the Shenango Canal between Utica and Binghamton, the Black River Canal. All these are constructed and they're all constructed along the specs of the original Erie Canal, which is about 40 feet wide, not about, it is 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. However, because of the success of the original Erie Canal during this time period in the 1830s, after New York in only a decade pays off the entire debt of building the original Erie Canal. Imagine that, a government paying off its debts, right? Anywho, okay, good. I got a couple laughs. New York decides to invest more in the Erie Canal, expanding and enlarging the canal to be 70 feet wide and 7 feet deep. This expansion of the canal, which also straightens it out a bit, shortens up the canal, makes it have less locks, etc. It's going to cost way more than that initial $7 million, and it takes about 30 years to complete this expansion. But it greatly increases the capacity of the canal. So boats on the original, what's called the Clinton's Ditch Era Canal, can carry 50 to 75 tons of goods on them. The new enlarged canal carries boats of about 250 tons on it. So you can carry a lot more stuff, which is pretty good. There we go. Also, those engineers and laborers who worked on the canal, they keep following this canal boom, building canals across the country. We can see some of the biggest canals. I know we often have folks from other canal societies who watch these. My apologies if your canal is not on this map. I didn't design it. But yeah, they go and build thousands of miles of canal. And you can see the places that they go to, places like Cleveland, Cincinnati, Toledo, Pittsburgh, all of which grow as they develop canals. However, it took 8 years to build the Erie. It's going to take another, 8, 10 years to build these other canals too, many of which aren't as ideally located as the Erie. There is no Mohawk Valley for them to go through. And at this time period is also when railroads are finally starting to enter American life. So as a result of both kind of poor geography, lack of settlement, especially in those western canal regions, and competition with railroads, none of these other canals will be nearly as successful as the Erie. However, they will still have a huge development impact on the development of these states and the settlement of them by primarily Euro-American settlers, pushing more indigenous people out of the area. Also, interestingly, these are a huge deal in America at the time. Abraham Lincoln even initially runs for Congress on the hopes that he will be the DeWitt Clinton of Illinois. It's an actual thing he kind of markets himself as in his early campaign material. So yeah, you can see these canals having a major impact on the country. But again, none will be as successful as the Erie. So let's talk a bit more about the impact of the Erie then. Here you can kind of see it. This is a map, an aerial view of Syracuse in the 1870s. Syracuse is the juncture of both the Erie, which is running through the middle of this image from the top to the bottom. It's a very oddly oriented image. You're looking from the north, you're looking south, kind of, if you're reading from left to right. But anyway, moving diagonally across the left side of the screen is also the Oswego Canal. You can see down in the lower portion of this the giant salt fields of Syracuse as they evaporate away water from salt brine, leaving behind the salt. And it leads us to the question, how did New York State pay to build and maintain all of these canals? The answer to that question can be found right here at the juncture of those two canals. So let's zoom in there a bit. This is the building that is at the intersection of those two canals. Constructed in 1850, this is how New York State paid for its canal system, a waylock. New York had 7 waylocks across the system in Albany, Troy, Utica, Syracuse, Rochester, Oswego, and Waterford. Syracuse's was the busiest of those 7 because of its proximity to the salt fields and also because it's at the intersection of 2 of them, probably the most successful of the lateral canals, the Oswego Canal, plus the Erie you've got there, right? So the way a waylock works, you bring a canal boat into the way chamber, which functions the same way as a lock, right? You make a closed system and then drain the water out of it. This particular one had a culvert that went under the canal to Onondaga Creek, where it emptied out. The chamber would empty, your boat would rest on a giant scale. You'd bring it in at the beginning of the season empty, they'd get your empty boat weight. That's kind of your tear weight for the rest of the season. And every other trip you take on the canal, you'd bring your boat in, they'd weigh it again, do the math on what your full boat is versus the empty one. And then every good had a specific toll assigned to it. This allowed the state to kind of do some economic planning, make sure that industries they wanted to encourage could thrive, industries that they might want to discourage could be discouraged. Kind of the most famous example of this is salt. New York produced salt had a significantly lower toll on it than quote unquote foreign salt, which means any salt made outside of New York. Thus encouraging people to ship New York State produced salt out of it, right? Yeah, so that's how a waylock works. This one pictured here was built, like I said, in 1850 to accommodate the larger boats of the enlarged canal. The Syracuse waylock is the only remaining waylock. All the others were torn down over time. Interestingly, if you go to the Oriskany battlefield, you can actually see the remains of the Utica waylock. It is the obelisk that is out there for the Battle of Oriskany. But yeah, this building was saved in 1962. It was supposed to be torn down during the construction of the interstate highways through Syracuse, but the actions of the Canal Society of New York and the Junior League of Syracuse would save the building on the condition it become a Erie Canal Museum in perpetuity. And that's where we are today, still in the Waylock building. Right now, I am standing right above the Way Chamber. Yeah, so that's how New York pays off these huge debts incurred on the canal. They will stop charging tolls in 1883 to remain competitive with the railroads and provide a public option for transportation. This building will continue to be owned and operated by the state, though, until 1962, when Onondaga County purchases the building. Though, to be clear, the Erie Canal Museum is itself an independent museum, so please become a member. Anywho, that's not the end of the story, though, right? So I've talked a lot about the economics of the canal, but it's not just economically that the Erie Canal transforms New York and America. It's also socially. Radical changes will happen. Start right about when the Erie Canal is open. Pictured here is an iconic image from the Second Great Awakening. So transportation is incredibly fast comparative to before the canal and cheap. This allows people to travel the canal much more easily, much more quickly, and also send things like correspondence much more quickly as well. The first kind of major movement to occur along the canal, is this major religious movement, the Second Great Awakening, rejecting largely traditional Calvinist views on Protestant Christianity, predetermination stuff, that you can't really do anything to save yourself from hell or get yourself into heaven, right? Instead, preachers like notably Charles Grandison Finney will preach what eventually develops kind of into perfectionism, the idea that you have the ability to make yourself, and the obligation to make yourself better morally and society as well, improve its morals, and fight kind of the evils you see in society. You have a personal responsibility to do this. You also have a number of other religious movements, a lot of folks who, with all this massive change happening, kind of doomsday sort of groups, notably the Millerites, who think the world is going to end, and I believe it's 1848. When that doesn't happen, spoiler alert, they'll eventually develop into the Seventh-day Adventists. You've also got the Mormon Church is founded in Palmyra during this time period, the Oneida community out in Sherrill, radical perfectionists out there. Yeah, so you've got all this new form of Christianity. We'll talk a bit more about it later, some of its impacts, but a lot of reform movements are born out of this. And some of the most notable ones, we have a lot of monuments to them around the canal, which will symbolize them here. You've got the Abolition movement spreads along the canal. This is the Jerry Rescue Monument in Syracuse in 1851. Radical abolitionists. So the canal corridor is home to people like Frederick Douglass, Garrett Smith, Henry Highland Garnett. It's a long list of abolitionists that live along the canal. In 1851, they will rescue the man depicted here, William Jerry Henry, himself a freedom seeker from Missouri who'd been living in Syracuse, got arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. They'll break into the jail here in Syracuse that was right alongside the banks of the canal and help him get to Canada. So this area is a major route on the Underground Railroad. This is a huge event during that time period. You've also got the women's rights movement. Here's a statue in the canal side town, well, a couple of statues in the canal side town of Seneca Falls, depicting some of the less known figures of the women's rights movement who all spent time right along the canal. You've got Harriet Tubman, Martha Coffin Wright, Sojourner Truth, and Laura Cornelius Kellogg. But also living in Seneca Falls is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony lives in Rochester. And all these people are caught up in this kind of milieu of the canal, and they're able to. Frederick Douglass publishes his North Star newspaper just a block off the banks of the Erie Canal, right? Not by accident. It's because that newspaper, if it gets on a canal boat, can go anywhere in the world with water. Similarly, the voluminous writings that all these folks are making, they can go all across the country, etc. You've got a number of other reforms developed along the banks of the canal as well, including the temperance movement, prison reform movements, educational reform, and this is also, especially the capital region, is a major hotbed for some of the early labor organizing of the time as well. So the canal is building a new society in a lot of different ways, economically and socially. However, by the late 1800s, railroads were really starting to outcompete the Erie Canal. By the 1890s, it's becoming a major issue what to do with this canal. It was falling into disrepair. It was just too small to remain competitive with the Erie. There is a project in the 1890s that tries to expand it again. However, the money for that is appropriated, $9 million. It's called the $9 million expansion. Again, they're not the most creative folks in 19th century America. Yeah, by this point, also the Erie Canal had become this hotbed of corruption as well. So that money just flows through the state's fingers quickly. And there's this real debate. Do we abandon the Erie Canal, just fill it in the cities, leave it to rot in kind of the lesser habitated areas? Or do we try to build a new, bigger canal that can compete with the railroads? And ultimately, the answer is building a bigger canal. One of the prominent leaders of this fight is Theodore Roosevelt, New York's governor at the time. The hope is that by building a new, bigger barge canal, one, it can improve the economy of New York, but also prevent the New York Central Railroad from gaining a monopoly across the state for transportation of large goods. So yeah, it's monopolies. This is the big era of monopolies and trusts. Teddy Roosevelt, not a big fan of monopolies, unless they're paying his campaign bills. Yeah, so ultimately in 1904, the Barge Canal will be authorized to begin digging. You can see here in this picture, the construction of the modern Barge Canal. You can see there's some new technology. You've got modern steam shovels, locomotives, but you also see a lot of guys with shovels, again, doing that, backbreaking labor. Again, this is largely immigrants. So I should have mentioned the enlarged canal is almost done almost entirely by Irish immigration. As time went on, canal digging became closely linked with immigrant labor because it's this really hard job. And then eventually, once it becomes associated with immigrants, non-immigrants want nothing to do with canal digging as well. But by this period, the 1900s, it is largely Italian and Polish immigrants who will be doing the work on the Barge Canal. Also, the new technology allows the canal to be rerouted through natural waterways. So the first two versions of the canal, it's all artificial ditch. They use no natural waterways except a small portion of the Tonawanda Creek. This new one canalizes the Mohawk and Seneca rivers as well as Oneida Lake. And it bypasses a lot of all of the major cities on the route. Cities do not want the canal going through them anymore. They view it as kind of this stinky ditch that has lost its relevance. And the Barge Canal, at minimum, it has to be 120 feet wide, 12 feet deep. So picture that if they built it in Syracuse, you would have had to knock down or somehow move, all those lovely buildings in Clinton Square and all the other buildings along the route as well. So instead, most major cities fill in their canal, replace them with new transportation routes, notably roads for the new transportation technology of cars. That's why you'll see a lot of Erie boulevards in most upstate New York cities. That's where the Erie Canal generally went through. Rochester, though, does build its subway line in the subway line in the tracks of the old Erie, though, before building a road on top of it as well. It's interesting. And they will build the new Barge Canal in about a decade and a half. It's completed in 1918. And here it is. You can see it there in the background. This is right in about Canaan-Jahari, where they're all connected, well, right next to each other. This is where there's that pass through the mountains. And the Barge Canal, it's originally, actually, because it opens in 1918, it gets taken over by the federal government very briefly, who operates it and most other major transportation routes during World War I to ensure the most efficient use of transportation for the war effort. This is not a great time for the canal because that transportation board is run by railroad men who have a vested interest in making the Barge Canal look bad. But afterwards, when the state takes it back over, the canal becomes a pretty important shipping route for the next 50 years or so. It reaches its height in the 1930s, carrying, I believe it is over 30 million bushels of grain at one point in 1 year in the 1930s. However, in 1959, the St. Lawrence Seaway would open, allowing much larger boats to pass through. And you would see a significant decline in canal traffic after that, but there would still be significant traffic into the 1970s, especially for bulk goods like oil. And anyone who watched in January saw the Day Peckinpah, which carried cement. However, nowadays, we still have the New York State Canal System. We see it here. Its four remaining branches, the Oswego, Cayuga, Seneca, and Champlain canals, as well as the main spine still of the Erie Canal. So let's talk about the canal today. For the last 7 years now, and for one more year, we have been commemorating the Erie Canal's bicentennial of its construction between 1817 and 1825. As part of that, New York State launched what's called the Reimagine the Canals campaign with the goal of making the canals relevant for the next 200 years. The biggest use of the canal today is primarily recreation. Last year alone, 4 million people traveled the recently completed Empire State Trail. This is one of the key initiatives of Reimagine the Canals. It's the longest single in-state trail system. I've now ridden my bike across it a few times. Some other folks here who have, at least one more person will soon. The trail gets tons of use. Central New York is the busiest for recreational boaters as well. There are tons of events that happen throughout canal communities. It's still an important part of towns that it historically went through and continues to go through with a lot of events, festivals, recreational moments along the route of the canal. And it still is occasionally used for commercial shipping. Pictured here is the 2017 transportation of a number of Genesee beer brewing tanks. These things were massive. They're like the size of the room that we're currently in. They couldn't fit down the thruway or railroad tracks, so they had to be transported by barge. That is the primary use commercially of the canal at the moment, is for these sorts of oversized objects. Last year, parts of a nuclear submarine traveled down the canal. Turbines for windmills go down the canal as well. We think there's, some potential to ship more on the canal. An interesting thing. So another part of the Reimagine the Canals initiative is to try to make New York more resilient to climate change through the canals. A great example of that has been in Western New York. A lot of farmers are now irrigating their fields with Barge Canal water. This has been something that's been done since about the 1930s, but they're really expanding it now to allow farmers to have more consistent access to water, which will allow them to, one, just know they'll have water for their fields because there's an increased amount of drought in New York these days, but also it allows them to grow higher value crops like fruits, etc. What is it, Oak Hill? Is that where the US Open was last year? Down in Rochester? Anyone know? Okay, there's a golf course in Rochester that the US Open was hosted on. Its greens are watered by Erie Canal water, interestingly. But Barge Canal barges are 300 times more fuel efficient than trucks. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind for the future. But also people are looking at how the canal can continue to improve communities. One of the most interesting initiatives of this like is what's pictured here, a pocket neighborhood in Canastota. It's a housing kind of development where the idea is people would be able to live right on the banks of the canal, have access to the incredible recreational opportunities of the canal, as well as in Canastota, you're right next to the thruway, you can get to work in Syracuse, etc. Pretty easily, and form hopefully a more tight-knit, there'd be a lot of shared spaces in here, community, similar to the ones that would have existed on the banks of the canal historically. And there's a lot of other stuff too, but I see I've managed to run over my time slightly on this, which is rare for this talk. But yeah, that's the canal, past, present, and even a little of the future. Are there any questions? Yes, Jim.
One thing that might be, I don't know how you do it, but the Mohawk River, as you know, when it reaches the Hudson, it falls, Cohoes Falls.
Yes.
And Cohoes Falls is about, what, same width, isn't it? No. It's almost same height as Niagara.
It's similar to Niagara, yeah.
And most people don't realize that. That it even exists. It's only about 7 miles north of Baltimore.
Yes.
But the other element is to really do the whole Erie Canal. Ultimately, you had to build lots.
Yes.
All the way down those falls.
Yeah. So for those of you who are online who couldn't hear things, Jim was talking about the Cohoes Falls, almost the same size as Niagara. And they presented, a major challenge. I believe it's 19 locks. Overcome that difference in height between the Hudson and up to Schenectady. It took a whole day of those 5 to 7 days to just make that about 20-mile journey. That's really one of the first railroads in America is constructed between Albany and Schenectady to allow passengers to forego that grueling journey around Cohoes Falls. Just take a shot between Albany and Schenectady. My other fun fact about that railroad, its first train was named the DeWitt Clinton.
Got a slap in the face.
Any other questions?
Could you maybe comment some more about the monument at the Oriskany battlefield made from the stone?
Yes, question was about the Oriskany Battlefield Monument. Yes, there is a monument there at the Oriskany Battlefield. It's a big obelisk. And from the accounts I have seen, it is constructed at least in part from stones from the Utica Waylock building. I believe it was built during kind of the FDR administration, I think when he was governor of New York, but it might have been New Deal era. Yep, they recycled it. So,
Derrick,
Yeah.
the Waylocks here was 1850, I think you said.
yeah,
How were the tolls collected between 1825 and 50?
great question. So yeah, Howard tolls collected before 1850 here. This is actually Syracuse's fourth Waylock. There were earlier Waylocks. They were all located across the street, kind of up the Oswego Canal, where James Street is now. They had smaller scales. Initially, they tried to figure it out by water displacement. However, that was not a super accurate measurement scale. Also, canalers learned how to cheat it. Others hadn't read their Archimedes, didn't really understand how buoyancy worked. Yeah, they eventually moved over to scales. But yeah, like I said, the boats got a lot bigger with the enlargement, so they had to build this. This scale, actually, when they finish it, is 12 feet too short.
Oh, yeah, on either end,
Yes, yeah, so.
the cradle on the bottom.
Yes, the cradle was actually too small still here when they finally completed the enlargement, but at that point, the damage was done. And lots of damage could be done to boats as well. But, yeah. That answered. Any more on Zoom? No? Any more in person?
I noticed when Chuck Schumer announced yesterday that Micron may be built, he characterized this as the greatest thing for Syracuse since the Erie Canal.
Yes, yes. Yes, all of New York's politicians love to say that Micron is our new Erie Canal moment. And since I know they're all watching right now, Chuck Schumer, Kristen Gillibrand, Kathy Hope, come to the Erie Canal Museum, learn about the Erie Canal from us or something. Yeah, and the treasurer of Micron, especially, come here, learn about the Erie Canal, bring your checkbook. That'd be great. Yes. So learn about the Erie Canal and what exactly an Erie Canal moment means. Yeah, anything else? All right then. Great, thank you.